President Obama has made it very clear that we are going to prevent Iran from having that type of nuclear weapon that they were going on the track to obtain. So if they decide to go down that route, they know that they will do so at their peril.
CIA Director John Brennan warning what will happen if there's no deal and Iran pursues a nuclear weapon. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Radio talk show host Laura Ingraham, Judy Woodruff, co-anchor of the PBS NewsHour, Fox News contributor Liz Cheney, and Bob Woodward from the Washington Post. Well, Laura, Director Brennan seemed confident that if there is a deal, that we'll be able to verify it, and if there isn't, that we'll be able to stop it. Do you share his confidence?
I'm skeptical, and the interview was fascinating because you got into not only this issue, but then you went back and we examined why we missed ISIS, what was going to happen with ISIS, how lethal ISIS would become. So the trust, I think, is based on recent experience. How credible are their reassurances that if they go off the tracks, we'll be able to stop it? We weren't able to see what was about to happen in the Middle East with the rise of ISIS. So
we've also missed a lot of what Iran has done over the last decade. And now that Brennan wasn't on the watch then, but
well, and the
you know, a lot of those,
and all the nuclear sites that you also alluded to. So there's a track record of spotty results, I think, for American intelligence. And I'm glad you got to the point about morale at the CIA, which I think took a huge hit. He acknowledged that. So while I understand that the administration is trying to reassure all these skeptics in Congress, it's on Capitol Hill that they're worried about, I think given recent history, that is a difficult sell to make, and especially now with this conflicting deal with, well, Iran's fighting ISIS, but Petraeus says Iran's his predecessor saying that's the big threat here. I think it's difficult for this administration to make this case at this point with this recent history.
We asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Annette Damash. She writes, what has changed in our government where we are now considering allowing Iran even limited nuclear development? Judy, how do you answer Annette? Because from what we understand, and obviously we only know the reports, Iran, under this deal, would be able to have 6,000 centrifuges. They would be able to continue to enrich uranium, although at lower levels. Whatever happened, I guess Annette is asking, to the old policy of no nuclear program, period?
Well, I also thought the interview was fascinating, and I was struck when he said you were asking him about how do we know some of these very questions you're asking us. How do we know what Iran is up to? And he said we went to school, in effect, on the mistakes that were made. So they are saying that they know more about what Iran is up to than we know, than they can talk about. So one has to assume that that's the reason that they're prepared to say Iran can do more. But I just want to say what we know about the negotiations, Chris, at this point, is that serious issues are, yes, the centrifuges, the quality of the uranium and so forth, but the sanctions are I am told by people watching this closely, are what is really holding this up at this point. The U.S. wants them phased out. The Iranians are saying, no, we want them gone immediately. The Iranians have come a little bit in the direction of what the U.S. wants. They've talked about something called snapback, wherein if there's any material breach of an agreement, the sanctions would come back in full force. But it is still believed by the people watching these negotiations very closely that that's not enough, that the Iranians still need to do more.
And interestingly enough, supposedly, according to reports, the French are taking a harder line than the U.S. is in terms of holding Iran's feet to the fire. Director Brennan and I also discussed at some length the question of the claims by the administration during the re-election that Al-Qaeda was on the run. Here's a look at that exchange. Didn't you give the American people, and the president give the American people, a false sense of confidence back in 2012 about our fight against Islamic terrorists at a time, perhaps not so coincidentally, when the president was running for re-election?
There was no sense that I think either I or the president or others gave to the American people that terrorism was going away.
Liz, Brennan said that in fact, core al-Qaeda in Pakistan has been decimated. His argument is ISIS is a completely different proposition.
Well, decimated only if you think decimated means rapidly spreading throughout the region. I mean, you have a situation where obviously during the election the president's position was I'm keeping America safe, I've gotten bin Laden, therefore the problem's over. He said it repeatedly. And what we know now from the bin Laden documents, for example, that have come out through some court cases, although they need to release more, is that that absolutely wasn't the case. You've got a RAND study that talks about 50% increase in al-Qaeda affiliated groups since 2009. The president knew it wasn't the case, and he said it anyway for political purposes.
But Brennan seems to draw this line between al-Qaeda and groups like ISIS and Boko Haram and other groups. Do you think that's a fair distinction?
No, I think that clearly what we've seen is that, you know, ISIS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and al-Qaeda affiliated organizations themselves are rapidly spreading, and bin Laden, who I think even Director Brennan would say was at the center of core al-Qaeda, we know that the documents that they've released from the Abbottabad raid are the documents that show he was sort of this lion in winter. But that is not what the rest of the documents apparently say. The rest of the documents demonstrate that he was very clearly directing al-Qaeda throughout you know, his time, even when he was in hiding.
Bob, when I talked with the intelligence community this week, particularly about this question of misjudgments, they used a phrase I hadn't heard before. They said political successes and intelligence failures. And what they were saying was, look, some of those times when the administration throws us under the bus and says, well, you know, they didn't, and particularly they mentioned this about ISIS, and they underestimated the spread of ISIS. They say, we were telling the political leaders in 2014 a lot of this stuff. They didn't react to it, and now they blame it on us.
Well, I think if you look at the overall in the interview, there's a lot of, from Director Brennan, no, wrong, hogwash. And you look at this, and is he giving an accurate, fundamentally accurate picture of the world? I think it's kind of whitewashed, and there's a lot of happy talk here. And such as this idea that they have blunted and stopped ISIS in Syria and Iraq. I mean, there's some pluses. You get into the details here. There are indeed some negatives, and I think if you step back, where you really have to here, the world is a much more dangerous place than he is outlining here. That the ingredients of instability in Syria, in Iraq, in the whole region of the Middle East, in Pakistan, North Korea, you know, this is a time of deep anxiety, and the real question is this an intelligence picture he's presenting to the president, or is he being more realistic when they talk?
Judy?
I was just going to say, I'm listening to Bob, but I also looked at, as I'm sure you did, he gave a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations at the end of last week, and he talked about this being the most unstable period since the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, he didn't, in at least what I was hearing, he didn't understate, I think, the threats out there. So,
you know, but he didn't say this in that interview, and he kept saying, when you posed some skepticism, he would say, oh no, that's not true, or that's wrong, or hogwash on these documents.
One does get the sense at some point that there is some post hoc attempt to justify the Nobel Peace Prize here, right? Even the French are saying, the French ambassador to the United States says this is a bad tactic to say we really must have a deal, at least the beginnings of a deal, by March 31st. Why? We want a deal that's good for America, that's good for this country, and obviously regional security, global security, but this has to be good for the United States. And I think, Bob, I think you hit on it. The sense that the world is more chaotic, you bet it is. We're not better off than we were in 2009. When it comes to security in the world under Obama's leadership. Our influence is in decline, and the world is more dangerous.
Iran was continuing its nuclear program too, and I know your dad, it was one of the things he was most upset about was that they didn't intervene in Iran.
Well, I think, you know, one of the other points here that it's important to raise in the Brennan interview is the verification point. Judy touched on this, but the IAEA last month said the Iranians are not currently living up to their obligations. So for Director Brennan to say, and I noted twice, he said we have a good understanding. He didn't say complete understanding, but I think frankly it is false to give the American people the idea that we know what is going on inside Iran or that we will be able to verify after this agreement. The French I believe, sadly, I never thought this sentence would come out of my mouth, but the French actually have a much more realistic and harder line approach to this.
All right, we have to take a break here.